It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I had the privilege to interview the time traveler, Lean Ferman. How are you doing today?
Great, Brandon. It's really an honor to be on the show today, and I pronounce my name Len Ferman, the sports time traveler. So thank you again for having me on your show.
Thank you. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to get started in going back in time and visiting sporting events?
It's a really interesting story. It was very much a personal journey. I just turned 60 years old. I became a true sports fan in the year 1970. I was growing up in the New York area, and my first love in sports was the New York Mets. And like the first thing I learned was my team that I lived for back then, the New York Mets, we had won the World Series the year before in 1969. But when you're 6 years old and you think back even a year, it's like ancient history. And I knew nothing about that. I wasn't aware of baseball at the time. And so for the last, for almost 50 years, I was thinking I missed the 1969. And so when we got to 2019, and it was the 50-year anniversary of the Miracle Mets of 1969. And if anybody doesn't know the story of the Miracle Mets, it's one of the more unbelievable stories in the history of all sports. The Mets were a franchise expansion team in 1962. They were the worst team in baseball, the laughing stock of American professional sports, not even just baseball, from 1962 to 1968. And then in 1969, they win 100 games and win the World Series. It's like it's one of those things you wouldn't believe it if it was a Hollywood script. And here I had missed it. I spent my whole life thinking I missed that. So in 2019, I felt this need to figure out, well, how can I experience what I missed from 1969? So I started reading books about the 69 Mets, and that was interesting. You heard interesting stories, but I just still didn't have the feeling like I had experienced it. So then I realized, when I was a kid, I didn't watch every game. I probably, you couldn't watch the games on tape. There was no such thing. You couldn't see the highlights on YouTube. There was no such thing. You couldn't just turn on ESPN any time of the day and catch up with what's going on. There was the 2 hours that the game was on. And by the way, the games only took about 2 hours back then. There was the 2 hours the game was on, and that was it. And not every game was on television. And I was a busy person. I was going to school. I had bedtime that was usually before baseball games ended. So I couldn't watch any West Coast games. So maybe I saw one or two games a week. The primary way that I consumed baseball and followed the Mets was by reading the New York Times every morning. And so I realized in 2019 that the New York Times had now put all their newspapers on archives online. And so it occurred to me that if I read the newspaper every day, I could essentially have the same experience I would have had if I had been a little bit older and was following the Mets in 1969. So I start doing this, and I realized this is really incredible because if you go day by day and read the newspaper, you start really getting the feeling like you're there. And so I have a bunch of Mets friends. So I started emailing them. I'd say, because you learn about all these things that are really cool and you didn't know about. So I'd email my friends and say, hey, guess what happened today 50 years ago? And and after the 1969 season, I figured, well, why not keep going? You know, I I I I know I was a Mets fan in 1970, and I kind of remember, them being a mediocre team, but I don't remember all the details. I don't remember all the games. So I kept going 1970, 71, exactly 50 years ago, reading the newspapers every day. And when there was something interesting, I'd email my friends. Well, after a while, my friends start telling me, hey, this is interesting stuff. You should be sharing this with more people. So early last year, around the end of May in 2022, I finally put it together and found out that there was a platform for writers called Substack, and that I could produce my own newsletter. And so I started the Sports Time Traveler around the end of May in 2022 with a focus on all sports, not just the New York Mets. I was naturally following the Mets, but I'm a big sports fan. I like all sports. So I was covering other sporting events. And every day, so what I do is every day I wake up and I look at the current sports. When I'm done looking at current sports, then I go into the newspaper archives and I'll read the New York Times and the New York Daily News and several other newspapers every morning, exactly 50 years ago. And when I find a really good story, and I like to tell my subscribers, I only share stories when there's something so exciting, so compelling, I just have to share it with you. And that keeps it really fresh and exciting, I think, for the people who follow me.
Of course, growing up a New York Mets fan, what was that like getting to go back in time and seeing the Mets win way before you were born?
Well, following that 1969 season, that was really something to see how it all kind of came together. The interesting thing that I didn't really know was even though they won 100 games, they were pretty much still a mediocre team early in the season. They started the season 18-23. So at the quarter-way mark, there was no sign they were doing anything special. And the Chicago Cubs built a big lead, and they had real star power. They had Ernie Banks, the Hall of Famer who had over 500 home runs. Billy Williams, I think he's in the Hall of Fame too. Ferguson Jenkins was their top pitcher. They had real, you know, real good pitching. They had power hitting, and they looked like this was going to be their year. The Cubs had not won the pennant since 1945. This was, by the way, 1969. It was the first year of divisional play. Prior to 1969, all the teams in the National League, all the teams in the American League, just there was no divisions. There was no playoffs. You won the pennant by being the team in first place, and you went straight to the World Series. 1969 was divisional play, and the National League East was kind of up for grabs. Besides, the Cubs had not been a perennial powerhouse, but the Cubs were good that year. But then the Cubs, well, even into late August, the Cubs are still holding on to first, and the Mets are like 10 games over 500 in early August, and then the Mets go on this unbelievable tear. They finished the season something like 38-11. I mean, a real tear, and they come from way behind the Cubs and end up beating them by 8 games. And so Cubs fans were obviously crushed. For Mets fans, it's the miracle of 1969. But then they didn't stop there. They played the Atlanta Braves in the championship series. This was when Hank Aaron is in his prime. He hit 44 home runs in 1969, and the Mets go in there and sweep the Braves. And then they play a team that's really been underrated in history, the Baltimore Orioles of 1969 and 1970. They have the record of most wins over a 2-season stretch, 1969 and 1970. They won 108 games and won the World Series in 1970. In 1969, they were a tiny bit better. They won 109 games. And so, and this is the Orioles team that's already won the World Series in 66. This is the team that has Frank Robinson, Rex Robinson, Luke Powell. They've got unbelievable starting pitchers, Dave McNally, Mike Cuellar, Jim Palmer, and they're just prohibitive favorites. And in game one in Baltimore, they win the game. And so it looks like we're set up for a sweep. And then the magic happens. And you can actually watch these games on YouTube. So when we hit exactly 50 years ago, back in 2019, I watched each one of the World Series games in its entirety on the 50 years from the day it happened. And that I'm going to have to go back and do it again sometime because it was such an unbelievable experience. It played out again like a Hollywood script. In the second game, Jerry Koosman, who was the Mets' second best pitcher. By the way, when they lost game one, they had lost with their best pitcher, Tom Seaver. Tom Seaver's nickname is the franchise. That's how important he was to those Mets. So when you lose game one and you've already lost, blown your best pitcher, it doesn't look good for you. And yet Jerry Koosman the next day goes out and throws a no-hitter through 6 innings. And that's something that startled me. I never knew, I know about Don Larson's perfect game in the World Series. And I know somebody else had a no-hitter in the playoffs a few years ago. But I didn't know that Jerry Koosman of the Mets had thrown 6 no-hit innings against one of the great teams in history. And so the Mets go on to win game 2. And then game 3, they had just an unbelievable sequence of events. The Mets had a fan favorite outfielder, Tommy Agee, and he made 2 of the greatest catches in World Series history. They say it saved 5 runs. He also hit a home run himself in the game, so he almost single-handedly wins game 3. And then in one of the games, it was either game 3 or game 4, there was a sequence that happened that you couldn't, you just, another one of these things, you wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen. In the top of one of the innings in the middle of the game, Frank Robinson has a ball come in real close to him and hits the dirt, but Frank Robinson insisted it hit his foot and he should have been awarded first base. And he argues viciously, and he goes into the dugout and he's throwing things out. I mean, he's just irate that he was not given first base. After he had, I think he had struck out or something after that. So the bottom of the next inning, the bottom of the same inning, the Mets' Cleon Jones comes up. That same thing happens. A ball in the dirt, but this time the umpire. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the incredible part of the story. So the umpire says same thing. It's a ball. It didn't hit you. So the ball happened to roll into the Mets dugout somehow. And Gil Hodges, the Mets manager, who was one of these managers who never came out and argued and was a very likable man, was thought to be a trustworthy man. He takes the ball and goes over to the umpire and he says, "Take a look at this ball. There's shoe polish on the ball. It obviously hit Cleon Jones' foot." And the umpire, trusting Gil Hodges, awards Cleon Jones first base. And so just an incredible sequence of events, how Frank Robinson and Cleon Jones have the same thing happen, and Jones ends up on first, Robinson doesn't. So the Mets win game 4 and game 5. After losing game 1, they sweep the Orioles, win 4-1. It's just one of the great stories in the history of sports. So now I finally feel like I've experienced that.
Of course, what was that experience like getting to cover the UCLA 1973 team?
Yeah, so I don't just cover the Mets. I cover lots of sports, and one of the things I was really looking forward to as I follow this rule, I call it one of my rules of sports time travel, that I only look back an exact number of decades. So I follow sports exactly 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. So in following sports exactly 50 years ago, one of the great stories that was happening earlier this year, 50 years ago, so that would be early 1973, was UCLA had an undefeated basketball season going, and actually it was their second consecutive undefeated basketball season going, and they were led by a guy who may still be the greatest player in college basketball history, Bill Walton. And some of the games are actually available to watch on YouTube. And so when there are games available to watch on YouTube, I'll put them in my articles and I'll let you know, where are some highlights. So you don't have to watch the whole game. I'll say, hey, look at this clip here and look at this clip there. And Walton had this absolutely stunning game when it counted the most in the championship game. And so here they are. They had an undefeated championship season in 72, undefeated regular season in 73, and now it's all on the line trying to win another championship, have two consecutive undefeated seasons with the NCAA championship. So, you need your best stuff. And Walton goes out and has what it's still arguably to this day the greatest single game in the history of college basketball. And you can actually watch that whole game on YouTube, and experiencing that game is really unbelievable. What Walton did was he went 21 for 22 from the field. He missed one field goal. And and I was really interested. I knew this had happened. I'd heard about this game. I didn't know the way it happened. The only basket he misses is he's jumping up in the air. Somebody throws him an alley-oop, and he's trying to catch it and drop it in backwards. I mean, it would have been an acrobatic move for anybody to try to pull that off. And that's his only miss out of 22 shots. So he makes a free throw somewhere. He scores 43 points, and they win the championship. So that was very cool, getting to follow that 1973 UCLA basketball team. And another interesting kind of postscript story is, so as one of the things that's interesting about sports time travel, reading the newspapers every day, you'll find these little stories that you never knew about. Maybe people at the time don't even know, don't even realize. At the same time that UCLA was winning all their games in 1973, another team actually went undefeated. The North Carolina State Wolfpack went undefeated in 1973. Their star player was David Thompson, who went on to be a great pro. But they had a problem. They were banned by the NCAA for recruiting infractions, and they were not allowed to play in the tournament. So an undefeated team was not allowed to play in the NCAA tournament. So naturally, this brought up the question, hey, would UCLA have won the national title if they had to play NC State in the final? And so, that's a great, classic sports question. Well, I never knew that the athletic directors of UCLA and North Carolina State got together, and they agreed to have the two teams play against each other following season early in the season in December. So from my perspective, that hasn't happened yet. We're still in September here. So I got 3 months to go. I've been marking my calendar. I can't wait for 3 months from now to see what happens in the December 1973 NC State UCLA game. And this is another one of my rules of sports time travel. You can never look ahead. I'm following sports 50 years ago to the day, but I never look ahead. And the reason I do that, I found out kind of early on before I started the Sports Time Traveler. Sometimes I would look ahead, I would get impatient, and I realized what happens is it pulls you out of the moment. So suddenly you don't have this feeling anymore like you're actually back in time. But when you follow the sports every day, so the time, the elapsed time is the same for me now as it would be then if I was in real life. Then you kind of get this feeling like you're there. And so I don't want to violate that. So even though I know that this game took place 49 years and 9 months ago, and I could simply look it up and see what happened, I'm not doing that. I've got it on my calendar. I'm waiting for that game.
Of
So
course,
that,
when you talk about that, how hard is that to know that obviously something like that happened way back in the time 40 years ago, and it's hard to find and be patient to find out what the result is with how the world is now.
well, initially it was difficult because, the temptation is, to have instant gratification. I can look this up. I could go to college basketball reference. I could go to newspaper archives. There's lots of ways I could look up the game. But when I think about it, that's gonna destroy the experience for me, because more than anything else, what I'm doing with the Sports Time Traveler is I'm having this personal experience, and this feeling that I'm actually back in time. That gets me really excited, and I think my readers tell me it kind of flows through when they're reading my stories or listening to my podcast. In my podcast, I simply read my stories out loud for people who want to listen to them, And so I don't want to destroy that. I don't want to lose that personal excitement. And, and so, so I'm not looking ahead. That's one of my basic rules of sports time travel. And I've kind of gotten used to that now.
What was your experience like getting to cover the Colgate football undefeated season in 1932?
Oh yeah, well that's a great story. So I got to tell you the background on that. So last year in 2022, I was um, I was reading the Los Angeles Times every morning 50 years ago in 1972. The Los Angeles Times, by the way, had some great sports writers 50 years ago. In particular, they had columnist Bill Murray, who was absolutely sensational. We just, I hate, I don't want to, I really, I'm not trying to put down sports writers today, but Jim Murray 50 years ago, he was something special. So last year I was going through a period where every morning I would look at the Los Angeles Times from 50 years ago, primarily just because I wanted to read Jim Murray. So I'm on another page, and so while I'm there, I figure I might as well read the whole sports section. So I'm at another page where there was a columnist, I forget his name, but he had this column once a week where he would ask questions. He would ask his own rhetorical questions and then answer them, provide interesting tidbits about sports. So his question of that day was, have you ever been a college football team that went unbeaten, untied, and unscored upon? And I'm thinking to myself, well, unbeaten, I know there's been unbeaten teams, untied, of course, most teams that went unbeaten were also untied, but unscored upon? So I'm so then I look down and the answer there is yes. And my eyes just like almost jump off the page. There's been a team that went unscored upon for an entire football season. And then he says, and then he writes, yes, the 1932 Colgate football team was unbeaten, untied, and unscored upon. So instantly I'm thinking, oh my God, I got to look back and see this. And the nice thing about it was it fit right within my other rule of sports time travel that I can only go back an exact number of decades. So it was the 1932 team. This was 2022. So that was like, hey, I can do that. I can go back exactly 90 years. So this was like the end of November in 2022. So I go back to the end of November 1932 and I start looking around newspapers to see, hey, what's going on? Somebody must be talking about the 1932 Colgate team. So it just so happens they had just finished the season. And in their last game, they played Brown. Now, we don't think very much about Brown University football today, but in 1932, Brown was a powerhouse. And this final game of the season between Colgate and Brown was being billed in places like the New York Times as the championship of the East in college football. Both teams went into the game undefeated, and Colgate had this further specter that they were unbeaten and unscored upon. Brown, by the way, in compiling their undefeated record, had beaten 5 undefeated teams along the way. So they were a tough team, and they were playing in Providence at their home field. And so all the big sports writers of the day were there. Grantland Rice, who was one of the all-time greatest sports writers, he was there in the stadium. And what's really incredible is there is a 3-minute video highlights of that game. And in the game, at the end of the first half, Brown got the ball down to Colgate's 1-yard line. So here they are 1 yard away from scoring and ruining the unscored upon season. And first down, they don't get it. Second down, they don't get it. And then the clock runs out on halftime. So Colgate was saved by the clock at just a few inches away from Brown scoring. And then in the second half, Colgate routed them. Final score was 21-0. Of course, it was 21-0. And they had finished their unbeaten, untied, unscored upon season. So now all that was left was the Rose Bowl. In those days, there was only one one bowl game. That's it. I was surprised. I didn't know that. Uh, the Orange Bowl and the Cotton Bowl started up in 1935. So in those days, just the one bowl game. And by the way, the national championship was officially awarded before the Rose Bowl game. So the Rose Bowl game was thought of more as like a fun game between the best team in the East and the best team in the West. And so the way the national championship was awarded was through a points system by a professor at the University of Illinois named Professor Dickinson. And for about 15 years, his scoring system was the recognized way that college football championships were decided. And in 1932, I guess Newt Rockne had passed by then, and it was the Newt Rockne Award that you won by being the voted the best team or being rated as the best team. And oddly, there were several, besides Colgate, there were four other unbeaten teams that year. There was Michigan, Pitt, and USC. And so the winner of the rating system was not Colgate with their unscored upon season. It was Michigan. And when you look at it, when you look at common opponents, Michigan and Colgate didn't actually have a common opponent, but they had opponents that were common opponents of each other. And you can make a really strong case that Colgate really got shafted and that this Professor Dickinson from Illinois, his model like clearly favored another Big Ten team in Michigan. So Colgate gets shafted from the title that way. In fact, they finished fourth. USC had a much stronger case than Michigan. They had only allowed like 13 points the whole season, and so they're the choice to play the Rose Bowl in the West. And the way the Rose Bowl selection went was also kind of quirky. So in those days, the Rose Bowl committee chose the team that would play in the West. USC was the obvious Western team. And then the Western team that was picked, they get to select who they're going to play. So they get to invite a team. So naturally, their first choice is to invite Michigan because Michigan had been rated number one. But the Big Ten at that time had an odd rule, and they said no Big Ten team is allowed to play in any postseason game. So Michigan wasn't allowed to play in the Rose Bowl. They tried to appeal, but the vote was going to take too long. So USC said, we're moving on from Michigan. So at this point, Colgate expects that they're going to get the invite. In fact, through some back channels, it was kind of leaked that they're going to get the invite. There were some articles that said they're going to be invited. And then word comes out that USC had picked Pitt. And so then this great story ran around the country where the coach of Colgate, brilliant guy, his name was Andy Kerr. He was quoted as saying, "We were unbeaten, untied, unscored upon, and uninvited." And it really made for a great story. It's one of my favorite stories that I ever wrote about this whole, this season and how they were shafted from the national title and then uninvited from the Rose Bowl. And then Pitt goes out there and gets destroyed in the Rose Bowl. And even Pop Warner himself said that Colgate should have been the choice, and some people actually speculated that USC picked Pitt because they were afraid of Colgate. Colgate at the time, not only did they have this sensational defense, obviously didn't allow a point, but their offense, if you watch that 3-minute video, and anybody can see it, if you go to the sportstimetraveler.com, you can find the link to get to all my articles and just do a search on Colgate and you'll find it. And in the article there, it's this 3-minute video. It is breathtaking to watch because you don't see anything like it in football today. Andy Kerr was a magician of a offensive coordinator. He designed an offensive scheme that was so much fun to watch. It was like they were a bunch of magicians. You didn't know where the ball was. And I've never seen anything like it where all 11 players are perfectly in sync. I mean, not one of them is out of sync. Uh, and and they and as soon as the ball is snapped, there are people running in all different directions, and you literally don't know where the ball is. And it's so much fun to watch that. And so there was speculation that maybe Colgate could have beaten USC. For his part, Anker, he didn't keep a grudge. He said, the idea of playing a game in January, it just doesn't favor us because, in upstate New York where Colgate is, you're already getting a lot of snow by December. And he said, we can't train in the snow. And this is not a time where they would just take everybody for 3 weeks and go out to California. So he said, it wouldn't, we we wouldn't have been able to be as effective without training. And when you watch their offense, you don't run that offense unless you're drilling it every day. So that's really that's one of the great stories that I never knew anything about, and it's those stories that I never knew about. They're the ones that I think I appreciate the most. Some stories like I knew that Bill Walton and UCLA had won the NCAA championship in 1973, and Walton had had this great game. I knew that. It was still fun to watch that and cover it, but it wasn't as fun as discovering the 1932 Colgate team and then going back in time virtually and following that. That was really something.
What was your experience like getting to cover the Will May, the Baseball Hall of Famer that also competed in track and field?
Oh, you're talking about Bob Hayes.
Hmm.
Yeah. So Bob Hayes was one of the great athletes of the century, the 20th century. He happened to be from Jacksonville, Florida, where I've lived for the past 30 years. So he's a real local hero here. But on a world stage, he became a household name in 1964 when he won the 100-meter dash at the Tokyo Olympics and anchored the 4x100 relay team, American relay team. So he won 2 gold medals, but he didn't just win 2 gold medals. He did it in such dominating fashion that he really took the title that you earn when you win the 100-meter dash in the Olympics of being the world's fastest human. He took that to another level, and for many years he was recognized as the world's fastest human. And the interesting thing about Bob Hayes, you don't see it very much these days, but as soon as the Olympics were over, he became a professional football player and became one of the best wide receivers in football, playing for the Dallas Cowboys in the mid to late 60s and into the early 1970s. And then in 1972, he was hurt, and the Cowboys changed their offensive scheme to go more to running and short passes that didn't utilize his downfield speed. And so he had a terrible season in 1972, and he wasn't very happy. And so then going into early 1973, an interesting thing happened. Um, in track and field at that time, track was only an amateur sport. If you wanted to compete in the Olympics, which was only amateurs in those days, you had to stay an amateur there. And so there was no money for athletes in track. And Hayes already was ineligible for the Olympics because you couldn't be a professional in any sport and then go back to the Olympics. So in 1968, 1972, he was not allowed to compete in the Olympics. But in the spring of 1973, so exactly 50 years ago from this year, a professional track circuit was formed for the very first time. They called it the International Track Association. And to try to get it off the ground, they needed to do some things that would get them big PR. So they asked Bob Hayes if he would compete in the International Track Association, and they were going to create a special event just for him, a 40-yard dash. 40-yard dash is not a typical race in any track and field meets. But as as most football fans know, 40-yard dash is something that's commonly done to measure the speed of football players in the combine. So Hayes agreed to compete. They had 16 track meets in the spring of 1973, and so as the sports time traveler, I was following these track meets, and I'm a big track fan. In fact, in this my virtual background here, uh, that's me in real life 39 years ago as a spectator at the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, where I was privileged to see all of the track and field events. So I'm a huge track and field fan. So I was looking forward to covering 50 years ago, this past spring, the track meets of the International Track Association. So Bob Hayes, they had 16 meets. He ended up running in 15 of them, and he won 14 out of the 15. And if you listen to him, he says he really should have won the 15th, but there was something about the officiating that he thought was off, and the race was slow. In most of his races, and anybody who knows 40-yard times will get this. In most of his races that spring, he ran 4.4 or 4.3, and that's unbelievably fast. 4.3 is really good time now, let alone 50 years ago. You didn't have with good technology on with the spikes and the tracks and everything. And the race he lost was only running 4.5. So it was pretty clear that even though he couldn't compete in the Olympics, he may still be the world's fastest human. And so Sports Illustrated actually ran an article on him in July 1973, where they posed the question, is Bob Hayes still the world's fastest human? And so that made for a great story. And then the Cowboys initially had been pretty upset with Hayes for running in the International Track Association meets, even though it was the off season. It was all in the spring. They're afraid maybe he'd get hurt. And but then when he comes to training camp in July, they realize he's in better shape than he's been in a long time. And in the it was either the first or second preseason game, he has a spectacular 55-yard touchdown pass from Roger Staubach, where Hayes um, darts with his unbelievable speed and gets way behind the secondary. So he's just all by himself for an easy touchdown score. And so here we are now. It's exactly 50 years ago in 1973. It's the first week in September. So the season hasn't started yet in 1973, just like the season hasn't started yet now. But the Cowboys are very hopeful that Bob Hayes is going to be back as a top wide receiver. And I'm going to be looking forward to following that.
Of course, being a track and field fan, what has that been like getting to cover these amazing track and field events throughout history?
Well, the big ones I've covered so far as the sports time traveler was the 1972 Olympics. And the cool thing about that was I remember the 1972 Olympics very well. I was 9 years old in the late summer of 1972. And I eventually became a runner myself. And I point to those Olympics at the, the, the pivotal moment in my life that where I said, I want to be a runner. There were several American athletes that performed incredibly well and became icons of American track, just legends. We had Dave Waddle won the 800 meters while wearing a golf cap. And then he forgot to take the golf cap off when he was on the victory stand. So while the stars and stripes being lifted, he still has his hat on. And it was a great story because he went from last to first in the last like 150 meters of the race and just barely won it. So I remember that happening live. And so to cover that was really cool. And then Frank Shorter won the marathon. It's the last time an American ever won the marathon in the Olympic Games. And a lot of people credit Frank Shorter winning the marathon in the 1972 Olympics as touching off the running boom in the United States. Before he won that, you almost never, ever saw anybody out jogging. If you saw somebody out for a run, you might have thought they were a shoplifter and they're running away from. I mean, you just didn't see it. It just people running in the street was a fearsome thing to see because We just didn't, nowadays you see somebody running, you're like, oh, they're getting some good exercise. Well, that's all because of Frank Shorter. And so it was a lot of fun to cover those things as well. And it's always great when there's good video of the events. So I'm not just looking at the newspaper archives, but I can actually insert the YouTube videos in my articles of those events. And so for the 1972 Olympics, I had all these great videos to share. So that was a great experience for me to go back and relive what I and see the things that I remembered and the things that I didn't remember from when I was 9 years old.
Of course, with the Olympics coming to LA in 2028, what would that be like getting to cover the Olympics for the first time when they were in LA?
Well, it's going to be very interesting. I might go ahead and break one of my cardinal rules of sports time travel, where I have to go back an exact number of decades. It's just going to be too tempting to say, okay, in 2028, it will be it'll be 44 years since the LA Olympics, since these LA Olympics are, it'll be 44 years, and I remember all that very well. And it'll be 96 years since the 1932 Olympics, which was held in this same stadium. Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum had the 1932 Olympics as well. So yeah, I think I'll have to break that rule and go back exactly 44 and exactly 96 years and cover those Olympic Games. So I'm looking forward to that.
Of course, for you, what will that feel like knowing that obviously you were there in person at that Olympics the first time when it came to LA and then covering it in
Well, of course,
2028?
it'll bring back a lot of great memories, a lot of nostalgia. I attended these games with my dad and my grandpa, and so it'll bring back great memories of being able to share one of the incredible experiences I've ever had as a spectator, and got to share them with the two very special people in my life. So it's going to be a nostalgic virtual trip back when we get to 2028 and we're seeing the real Olympics live, but also, I'll be going back and helping people see, hey, here's what happened 44 and 96 years ago, and reporting it in a way that is very different than anybody else reports history. Because one of the things I'm doing in the sports time traveler is I'm pretending that I've actually traveled back in time virtually, and so I'm reporting as though I'm actually there. I'm writing as though it's in the moment. I'm not telling you about history. I'm telling you about what I'm experiencing now. And so it's a very different way of writing that you don't see when people cover history. The other thing I do in all my articles that's very different is I'm thinking in terms of storytelling. I like to think of myself as a storyteller, not a sports reporter. And if you think about how any sports reporter now or then covers an event, the headline's always, here's what happened. Reds beat Pirates 5-3. And then the newspaper article is the story of the game, maybe starting out with the key highlights of the game. Like, Willie Stargell hit a 3-run homer and the Pirates beat the Reds. But that's not how I write. I'll give you an interesting teaser headline that draws you in to want to read, but doesn't give you a clue about what happened. And then I'm writing a story from start to finish. So the climax is who won the game. I don't give it away up front. I'm writing it like a story. And so that's a big difference in my articles. They're stories. It's not sports reporting.
Of course, what is that process like going out there and looking for those stories that happened back before news was ever popular?
Well, the interesting thing is that newspaper writing was in its heyday when you go back 50 to 100 years ago, because we didn't have cable television, we didn't have social media. The primary way people got their sports news was from the newspapers, or even on television. There was no national sports news. There was not a single national daily sports television show. The only way you got sports on television, sports news, was on your local news for maybe 3 to 4 minutes, you got news, sports news. So that's not very much. So the primary way you're learning about most sports is in the newspapers with the sports writers. And so the sports writers were, again, I don't want to bash sports writers today, but I feel my personal take is the quality of the sports writing was much higher back then. And it makes my job a little easier because there's a lot of rich content, and I can go back and look up multiple newspapers. Like when I'm following a Mets game, if they're in St. Louis, I'm also going to read the St. Louis Dispatch. Or if they're in Atlanta, I'm going to read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to get both sides of the story and fill in gaps and stuff. So what's interesting for me is I'm going back in time every day, reading the newspapers, and I'm looking for what's going to be a great story. So it's if I see this team beat that team and there wasn't really anything really exciting that happened, I'm not going to write a story about it. But when I see something really interesting, then I'm going to write a story about it. Like I'll give you an example. Um, Yesterday in 1973, there was something that really caught my attention in the New York Times that I wasn't looking for. I went to the New York Times yesterday to see how did the Mets do in their last game in St. Louis. That's what I was looking for. And I looked at the game, and it was an interesting game, but there was nothing super special to write about. But in the column next to the game, there was something that really caught my eye. It was that Arthur Ashe had played Bjorn Borg in the US Open tennis tournament in Forest Hills, New York, in the third round. Now, the interesting thing about this was Bjorn Borg was only 17 at the time. And I thought, oh, I want to take a look at this. That sounds interesting. You've got Arthur Ashe in his prime. And if your viewers and listeners don't know, Arthur Ashe is one of the great American tennis legends. He was the first African American to win a major tennis tournament. He won the 1968 US Open. He also won the 1970 Australian Open. The Australian Open, for anybody who doesn't know tennis, that's one of the four majors. So here he is in 1973. He's won two majors. He had lost the US Open tennis finals the year before. So he's hungry. He's in his prime. He's the number 3 seed in the tournament. We're only in the third round, and he's playing this 17-year-old kid from Sweden. Now we know today Bjorn Borg went on to be a Hall of Fame tennis player, but in 1973, nobody knows who Bjorn Borg is. So I read that article and I read a few more articles, and it turns out there is something absolutely fascinating that happens. And even better, it's captured on video, and there's a YouTube video. So in my article, I've got the YouTube video, and I focus in on a particular sequence that I never heard about. I call it the sensational sequence. It's where Borg loses the first set. You lose the first set, and you're playing the number 3 seed, and you're only 17. It's the first step towards you're going to be out shortly. But Borg comes back and wins the second and third set. He's now up 2-1, and he takes a 4-3 lead in the fourth set, and now he's got service. So if you got service, if you win that game, you're up 5-3. You're in command to win the match. So at 15 love starts this sensational sequence where he gets an ace, and then he gets another ace that just absolutely blows by Ashe, leaves him flat-footed. And then he gets another ace, and the third one is just so magnificent that you hear the crowd like gasping. It was incredible. 3 consecutive aces by this 17-year-old kid against one of the best tennis players in the world to put him up 5-3, and he goes on and he wins the set 6-4, and he beats Arthur Ashe. And I just thought that was mind-boggling, and get to see that. And I'm not a big tennis fan, but that, I'll tell you, that made me a tennis fan yesterday, because beauty of that, seeing those aces, is really something special. And So for me personally, this yesterday was really an incredible experience because it's something I never knew about. Only found out about it because I'm looking at the New York Times following the Mets, and this caught my eye. And then when I look into it to find this sensational sequence of three aces, it really was something special. It's one of those things that uh, really gets me excited about this whole idea of sports time travel because I keep finding these things like, this the sensational sequence with Borg and the 1932 Colgate team that I never knew about. And another one I never knew about was going back to last season. I was following the Miami Dolphins. If for anybody who remembers football history, there's only been one team in NFL history that's gone unbeaten for an entire NFL season and won the Super Bowl. The Patriots almost did it like 15 years ago, but then they lost the Super Bowl. But the Miami Dolphins in 1973 went 14-0 in the regular season, won two playoff games, won the Super Bowl 17-0. Nobody else has ever done it. But did you know that in the Super Bowl game against the Washington Redskins, the kickoff returner for the Washington Redskins was a guy named Herbert Mulkey, and he spelled his name a funny way, MUL dash KEY, had a dash in the middle of his name because when he was growing up in grade school, and his real name didn't have the dash in it, teachers and kids would call him Murky. So they'd look at the name and they'd say Murky. So he didn't like that. So he put the dash in there to call himself Mulkey. Well, Mulkey never played college football. He was playing. He was playing in early 1972. He was playing for the Packers. We all know the Packers. This was not the Green Bay Packers, though. This was a semi-professional uh, Packers team that was sponsored by a grocery store in Atlanta. So he's playing for those Packers. And a friend of his said the Washington Redskins are having a tryout. Anybody can go try out for the Washington Redskins. You need to go. So he scrambles, gets some money, goes up to Washington, D.C., and he makes the team. He makes the Washington Redskins, not the practice squad. He makes the team. And, this kind of sounds like the movie that came out about 10 or 15 years ago called Invincible with Greg Kinnear about Vincent Papali, who actually kind of did the same thing in the late 70s with the Philadelphia Eagles. They had a tryout. He made the team. He got the movie. Herbert Mulkey didn't get the movie, but he deserves the movie more than Vince Papali because Herbert Mulkey got to play in the Super Bowl, and he returned to kick in the Super Bowl. And more than that, when there was 2 games left in the season, the Redskins had the best running back in football, Larry Brown, that year. And Larry Brown got hurt. So they decided to put Mulkey in as the starting running back. And he rushed for over 100 yards. Vince Papali didn't do anything like that. And then in the playoffs, in one of the games in the playoffs to get to the Super Bowl, Mulkey had a key return that set up a score. And George Allen, the coach of the Redskins, gave the game ball to Mulkey. He said that his return in that game, it changed the arc of the game. And they don't win that game and go to the Super Bowl without Herbert Mulkey. This guy deserves a movie. And this was another one of these things that I would have never known about it, but I was following the Dolphins, and I came across, this story because they played the Redskins.
Of course, how do you balance being a sports fan and also being a sports journalist going back in time?
Yeah, it's difficult. So I'm still a Mets fan. So every day I do check in on how the Mets did in 2023. It's a little depressing, but I still check in on how the Mets did last night. And um, I live in Florida, so I don't get all the games. But whenever they are on television, I watch the Mets on TV. But then the second thing I'm doing every morning is going into the New York Times archives and checking out the 1973 Mets and anything else that's going on in the world of sports this day 50 years ago. So it's not really that difficult because I get it. I'm in this routine. This is what I do every morning. I go into the newspaper archives and search for stories.
What are some of your future plans with the sports time traveler?
Now, I'm glad you asked that because the 1973 baseball season's going to come to a close shortly. So I've got two projects coming up that I'm really excited about. Um, as you may know, the Hall of Fame football player Jim Brown passed away earlier this year. Now, Jim Brown, before my time, before the time of most people, he played in the late 50s and early 60s. He only played 9 seasons, but Jim Brown just might be the real GOAT in football. Everybody's saying Tom Brady's the GOAT. But I think if people knew more about Jim Brown, they would say Jim Brown was the GOAT. And so, following my when Jim Brown passed away, my instant inclination was, oh, I got to do some kind of tribute to Jim Brown because when Bobby Hull had passed away, one of the all-time great hockey legends, when he had passed away at the beginning of the year, I instantly did an article to honor Bobby Hull. And so I was thinking about doing the same thing for Jim Brown. Then I thought to myself, as sad as it is, you're going to get legends of sports that are going to pass away, every year. I don't want to just be the guy who eulogizes, all these people. I want to find a better way to honor them that fits within what I'm doing as a sports time traveler. And then I realized, hey, I only like to go back in time. My standard thing is to go back in time exactly 5 decades or 6 decades. Well, if we go back exactly 6 decades to the fall of 1963, that's Jim Brown's greatest season, with the 1963 season. And by the way, I know nothing about it because that's way before my time, and most people don't know anything about it. So I'm committed. I'm going to be following Jim Brown's 1963 season week by week, and I'm really looking forward to this because I think by the end of this, we're going to. This is just kind of my prediction, but I think by the end of this, we're going to start thinking, hey, the GOAT is really Jim Brown.
What
So I'm looking
advice
forward to that. Yep.
what advice would you give those people that are looking to do something similar to you and go back in time and see things that happen in sports events?
Well, well, my first advice is, hey, I'm doing all the work for you. So just read the Sports Time Traveler. Go to www.thesportstimetraveler.com and follow me. But if you really want to do this kind of stuff yourself, you have to subscribe to newspaper archives and go back in time and go into the newspaper archives and have this virtual sports time travel trip and go back and and read newspapers. So but if you don't want to do all that work, just follow the Sports Time Traveler.
Where can my listeners find your work at on social media and on website platforms?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do again is just go to my website, thesportstimetraveler.com, and that serves as a splash page to send you to all my social media and exactly where you can find all my articles, all my podcasts, my Spotify link. You can follow me on Facebook. But if you just go to thesportstimetraveler.com, then you'll find all that stuff in one place. So if you want to follow me on Facebook, just go to sportstimetraveler.com and you'll be able to find that. Or if you want to see my podcast or you want to find my Spotify site, it's all right there in one place, sportstimetraveler.com. I did want to mention the other project that I'm looking forward to. It won't take place until the spring of 1974, but it's another one that I've always known about, but I don't know much about it because I wasn't following it at the time. So when I was 10 years old in the spring of 1974, it was the first year that Dr. J, Julius Erving, was on the New York Nets. And I was still a New York Knicks fan at that time, so I didn't follow the Nets. But he had a very special season. And for anybody who doesn't know who Dr. J is, you really got to follow me with this because before Michael Jordan was Air Jordan doing all his acrobatics, Dr. J was the first one who who had that style of play, playing above the rim. He was the first one. He was the one who made dunking fashionable. He won the first NBA, ABA slam dunk championship. And 1974 may have been his best season. So that's going to be real special following Dr. J and the New York Nets in the 1974 basketball season.
Thank you again, Lean Ferman, for your envy and best luck in your future with the Sports Time Traveler.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'd love to come back again.
Thank you. You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Lean Ferman, for your envy and best luck in your future.
Thanks.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.